Good evening, everybody. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest tonight, David M. He is a California artist and digital art pioneer, computer art pioneer, among other things. It's my extreme pleasure to have him here tonight.
Thank you, Dina. Thanks, everyone, for showing up. I feel like I'm in my living room here. This is great. So, I told people this is going to be a casual evening. Feels very casual, and it gave me a real chance to look back on a whole lot of stuff that I haven't thought about in a long time. So, the title that we came up with was on the archaeology of the metaverse, 5 first. So let me explain a little bit what we mean by that, what I mean by that. And um, I thought I might call this talk Gone with the Wind or California Stories, because a lot of this is about something that happened here in California. And so digital art, as we know it today, is something that obviously developed internationally around the world. But California has a very special place in it, and my experience was in California. So when I talk about 5 firsts, these were things that were firsts for me. Every artist, it seems, wants to believe they were the first at doing something. So I'm just going to say these are 5 things that were my 5 firsts, kind of my personal aha moments that I had that took me to the next stage with all of this. So what got all of this going was I've actually just come off of what amounts to 2 archaeological projects. And one of them is I've just finished archiving all of what they call ephemera for the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, which has just collected them all like 10 days ago. So that made me look through literally my entire adult life. What have I done with it? What does it amount to? But also, what the heck was it? And a lot of people just don't really have a comprehension of where all this stuff came from. We've gone from a world that was before pixels, literally before pixels, to a world that's completely mediated by pixels. Everything we look, everywhere we see is somehow pixel mediated. So a friend of mine said to me recently, the only place that you don't see pixels anymore are in museums and kindergartens. It's basically true. Everywhere we look, that's how we interpret things. So we live in this whole different world. And I started to question, well, how did we get here? What were all the steps, the baby steps, the giant steps that took place to get us to where we are now? So that's a lot of what I want to explore tonight through my own personal lens. Other people will have other versions of how we got here, but this is mine. So I wanted to start by looking at a really big picture. So there's actually 2 sets of 5 firsts. I'll have my 5 firsts, but thinking about this, I realize there's another set of 5 firsts that is the history of art according to me. And when you think about when human consciousness, what we know about it, when did it first develop, where do we have records? There are things that go back a couple 100,000 years, but really it's about 50,000 years ago that we can look at stuff and go, yeah, somebody made that for a reason. And there was a communications network that allowed that to happen, and shared technology, shared tools, shared beliefs, shared spirituality, all that kind of thing. So that seems to have happened about 50,000 years ago. And then we get to, I'll just loosely call it Mesopotamia. You could call it Egypt, you could call it a lot of other things, but when you zero in, suddenly Mesopotamia, you've got like all this heavy duty stuff happening. You've got culture, you've got, huge architecture, you've got laws, you've got all of this armies, all of this stuff that took us, we're just on another level as a species. And the way that we communicate, through cuneiform text and so forth, we're just in a different place as a species. And so that took from 50,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago, the way I see it. And then you could argue with me about this, but really not that much changes until we get to the Renaissance. You know, we've got Athens, we've got all kinds of marvelous stuff that happens, but you know, we are really operating on a very simple set of structures that changes when we get to the point where people start painting on panels that are portable, and you get to a place where instead of everything being controlled by the church, basically, or the power structures that are out there, wealthy individuals start doing things, and artists start doing things on their own. Like, you know, Rembrandt, a little after the Renaissance or well, Leonardo, he's the Renaissance. You know, he kept the Mona Lisa till the day he died. He was still working on it. That wasn't a commission for the Duke of Milan. And that's a very different headspace. That's like the birth of modern art, really, from my perspective as I see it. And then things don't change a whole lot again until we get to about 50 years ago, the magic year for me of 1975. That's when I discovered digital everything. And I'll go there in a minute. But before that, you know, Picasso was painting with essentially the same brushes and paints as people in the Renaissance were. There, you know, he didn't need as many assistants because he could get it out of a tube and stuff like that. Up here, there were different things going on. But as a force in terms of tools and process and all of that, studio, things hadn't changed that much. And then we get to 1975. So we go from 5,000 years, 50,000 years, 5,000 years, 500 years, 50 years. And if you go from 1975 to now, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, we're going through a major transformational moment in terms of culture, consciousness, everything. You know, AI is about to take us to a place that we can't even imagine. Everyone in this room, I'm sure, is very sophisticated, but we don't know where we're going to be in 5 years. We really don't. So the term I've seen used a lot is the singularity. We're headed towards the singularity. So we've gone from 50,000 years and change. I think it's all going to happen in the next 5 years until we can talk about that. So that's my first set of 5 thirsts. Now, I want to go back to the world before pixels. Some of us are of an age in this room that we remember this time, and some of us are not. But I grew up in South America. I never saw television really till I was 10 years old. So I'm probably one of the last people on the planet, at least in this part of the civilization, that grew up without screens. Screens were not part of my life growing up at all. But when my family moved back to this country, I was just pushing 13, there was a lot of interesting things going on that happened during this period, which was the 50s. And one of the biggest ones was attitudes towards technology. And obviously we were going through a huge post-World War II change in awareness, consciousness, and how it integrated into our lives. You know, things like washers and dryers and fridges and things like that. That was a different picture when you go back to the 40s and the 30s. The 50s was like this whole new place, and this very ambivalent, almost a schizoid attitude towards technology developed. And it was this love-hate relationship. And it also incorporated an element of fear. And one of the big fear things was Sputnik. You know, what's going to happen when the Russians got up there first? Oh my God, what are we going to do? At the same time, you know, it's like a beautiful thing. It's like a beautiful piece of sculpture. It's as good as anything I ever saw in the Museum of Modern Art. But it had an extra presence that transcended its physical form and also transcended its implications as a threat to civilization as we know it. It also was taking us to a whole new place. So that was the fear side of it. But then there was this like weird sensual side to it too. I mean, you know, these great fins, the Cadillac Eldorado, you know, the magic touch of tomorrow. It's very sensuous and we're in love with it. The electric guitar, you know, Buddy Holly, rock and roll. It's coming in and we're all digging it. And at the same time, there's this on the other side of the coin where everyone is freaked out. I mean, you know, the fallout shelters. People are building these like bomb shelters here in LA, as if this is going to like save us all. And so there's this very odd mix of feelings and emotions. And on top of everything else is the computer. And the computer is here to mash our toes, to take away our being, our personality. Everything that makes us human beings is now under threat by these big machines. And so that was very much a feeling. There was a Katharine Hepburn and Tracy film. What was it called? Was it called Desk Set? You know, with the big, and the machine's going crazy and it's wild. And so that like manifested all of that into the 50s, going into the 60s, this odd feeling that we were losing control. And when it came to art, which in those days, when you think about it, this is abstract expressionism. You know, you've got Jackson Pollock who's like throwing the paint, just like the maximum of emotion. It's pre-Andy Warhol. And so they're at odds. And so the art world doesn't know how to deal with this force that is completely taking over everything. And then comes television. So television had been around for a while. If you know the history of TV, you can trace it all the way back to the 20s and the 30s and all the interesting bits and nooks and crannies and places that it went. But my generation is the first generation that grew up with it. And that puts you in a different place. Suddenly, people were having this shared experience. So we're in a pre-internet world, but we're also in a world where in one night, everyone's watching Gunsmoke or something. And the next day, everyone already watched Gunsmoke, and it's a shared awareness that's going on. And so human consciousness is changing on the level of how we interact in groups, older groups, younger groups, all that kind of thing. And then that's the beginning of the 60s. Then we get a little later into the 60s. And so this is, some of you will recognize from the Chicago Democratic Convention, which was pretty dramatic. And the thing I remember about it most was all of these people chanting, "The whole world is watching. The whole world is watching." And the whole world was watching. And that projected us into this future place that's very close to where we're living now without all of the web that came into being. And then, and I remember this, seeing this in New York, you know, first steps on the moon. And that, again, takes us as a species into this other place. We're now walking on other planets. We're now using technology in this way that we have to figure out how we feel about it. And in exact concurrence with that, music. And, you know, here's the incredible Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which some people might argue is a watershed in Western civilization. I would. A complete studio album. You know, this was not performed live. This was not created live. This was created in an electronic environment, and it changed everything. And then this was, I remember being in high school. I think I was in my senior year when I owned this. Walter Carlos, who later became Wendy Carlos, switched on Bach. So the idea of artists working with machines and this other stuff coming out the other end that was literally unheard of. No one had heard anything like this before. It was so wild. And so there was this great feeling that we're now transcending boundaries into a new place, and it's technology driven, and it's kind of a good thing. So now let me take another step. Now I'm going to get more into my own personal life before I start talking about the work that I did in the medium. And this is a Spanish, Mexican comic, actually. It's called Los Super Sabios. It's about these two young scientists. I don't know how old they are, maybe 19, 21. They're Paco and Pepe. This Paco is the blonde one, always wearing a tie and a white shirt. And Pepe's hair is always awry and he's crazy. But they're two scientists who operate an independent laboratory in Mexico City. And they have these wild and crazy adventures. It's a very DIY lab. And they build rocket ships. They too go to the moon. I mean, they just do unbelievable stuff. But I realize now, and looking back on it, the influence this had on me, which was the idea that being in a lab was kind of cool. It wasn't something to be scared of, like the big machine rooms. It was actually pretty hip. And so I would read this when I was, 5, 6, 7 years old. And unknown to me, it was having a big impact on where I was going. Another comic that I spent a lot of time reading, another comic artist, I should say, was the incredible Steve Ditko, who later went on to create Spider-Man. He created Doctor Strange. This is his early Doctor Strange phase. But he also had a previous history to that for comics like Amazing Fantasy that went into these crazy worlds and other places where different rules applied. And then when Doctor Strange came around, he was kind of the apotheosis of that. But the point was, this was a vision of the metaverse. As we know it today, this had already been visualized by many artists, but particularly to me by Steve Ditko. And so he was a huge influence on me growing up. Another comic artist many of you will recognize, Robert Crumb. And this is Zap number 0. So you get the idea, comic that plugs you in, haha, very cool. But inside, there was this interesting panel I came across recently that I'd forgotten about. And he lays it out. You will have the whole spectrum of experience at your fingertips. Fantasy machines will manufacture any world you ask for in a matter of seconds. We finally got there. For better or for worse, this is a perfect prediction of where we stand right now, looking ahead to where we're going to be 5 years down the road. And then there were other sources that came from the traditional art world. When I was about 14, I got seriously into art. We lived right outside of Manhattan, so it was an easy train ride into the city. And I spent a good portion of my teenage years at the Museum of Modern Art, at the Metropolitan, at the downtown galleries. Getting into art, you start to meet people very quickly. So even though I was only like 15, 16 years old, I was accepted into that world. And that opened doors in an incredible way. But there was thinking along these lines that I was exposed to. This is the great Max Ernst on the left and Giorgio de Chirico on the right, who were painting these paintings of other places that made you really kind of wonder what was around the next corner. You know, what else is going on here? What else could be implied by this space? And obviously the normal rules of physics do not apply. And so, again, by osmosis, I think I was picking stuff up that was going to inform me. And then there was the also just incredibly great Nam-June Paik, and who I'm going to guess most people in this room know who he is. He got into the electronic force, shall we say, more than anybody. There were other video artists, and so I started to learn about video art and things like that. He worked with a video engineer, Shuya Abe, and they made something called the Paik Abe synthesizer that started manipulating electronic frequencies and signals to create these kind of wild, abstractish images. And then he also was doing sculptural things. He was all over the place with it. But the point was, he was not approaching the technology and screens and electronica from a place of fear. He was embracing it. And so he was a great inspiration for all of us who came after that. And then almost finally, there were very few sources of information at that time. If you were into this stuff, there was like the Howard Wise Gallery in New York. And then it turned out that there were like things going on around the world, around the country, especially in California, there were things going on. And so this book by Gene Youngblood, Expanded Cinema, I think it came out in 72. I might have seen it in 72 or 73, had a radical influence on my thinking because it introduced me to people who were messing, in some cases, with chemistry in film, but a lot of them were working with electronics in film. So I learned for the first time about a number of artists who I later got to know and work with as colleagues. This is John and James Whitney, who are LA boys, who absolutely transformed my way of looking of what you could do, who you could be as an artist. And so thanks to Gene Youngblood, I was exposed to a lot of this for the first time. I was living in San Francisco. I had a studio there. I won't go into the whole Sturm und Drang of my life in the early days in San Francisco, but the Berkeley Film Archives were one of the few places in the world, really, certainly in the country, that had a pretty decent collection of experimental film. So, you know, Jordan Belson, I mean, many people who I was introduced through Gene Youngblood originally, they had this deal where you could rent a screening room there for something ridiculous like $15. You could get 3 hours, and they would play anything in their entire library for you. So I'd get a couple of cohorts together, and every Friday we'd go over. They'd give us a screening room until I'd watched everything in their collection. And that was sort of really my first big aha moment. Man, there's something going on here. And there's a reason I moved to California, and I think this has something to do with it. So that was a really big deal. So I started out in the analog world and inspired a lot by a lot of these sources. We don't have enough time to get into it here. For every story that I tell, there's somewhere between 10 and 20 more that there's just no time to even get into, but they're great stories. Here's where I was at in 1974. I'd started working with synthesizers, started working with musicians. There were a lot of Moog synthesizers around, Buchlas. So sound synthesis was pretty established. And so my original connection to it was much closer to music and performance, because that's what other people in the area were doing along those lines. So we started jamming. I built a studio that had dials, knobs, and switches up the wazoo. And this is a little bit of what that looked like. This is the kind of images that I was generating at that point, messing around with the signals, feeding the sound synthesizers into the video synthesizers, looping things back and forth, patching, keying, mixing, colorizing, all this great stuff, all analog. And then I had a background in sculpture, and so I started building up into rooms like maybe about the size of this room, actually, so that they were walk-in environments. And so these were my first little metaverse worlds, were places that were exhibitions that you could walk into, and there would be this moving electronic wash. And the key was that it was electronic. It wasn't just about light projection. It was about the electronic signal and what we could do with that. After about a year of that, I got as far as I felt I could get with analog synthesis. And I began thinking, it would be really cool. We've got these screens. The screens are made up of dots. Wouldn't it be great if we could control every dot on the screen? So I started asking around, and everyone said it's never going to happen. I said, okay. But at the end of that year, I was working with a gallery at the time, and the owner of the gallery had made his money in headhunting, electronic headhunting. And he had just placed someone at Xerox Park. He came to my studio one day, and at that point, so my studio is maybe about the size of this, and it's just like, wires and cables everywhere. I think I'm really hip. And he says, David, in the future, everything will be digital. And I had never heard the word digital. It didn't mean anything to me. I had no idea what he was saying to me. And so I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, last week I placed someone at Xerox Park, and they gave me a demo. The Xerox Park is Xerox Palo Alto Research Center in Palo Alto. This is it. This is the future. I said, hook me up. And he wouldn't do it. This is one of the many stories I can't get into because we don't have time. It's an unbelievable story, literally. But after a number of circuitous events, I did wind up at Xerox. And at Xerox, I saw my first pixel. I saw it in this room. And this is the room where everything that is pixel-driven today originated. A guy named Dick Schaup had built a device he called a frame buffer, what today we call a graphics card. And it could make color pictures on a screen and control every dot on the screen. And I can tell you my mind was blown. And this is part of the project I'm working on with the Computer History Museum, is figuring out the history of how Xerox Park happened. And so this is two views of the layout of the room. But I just want to bring attention, in the corner of the room, there's a picture. And you probably all know it. I'm not sure where it originates from. I'm not sure if anyone does. I don't know if it's the 15th century or the 13th century. But it was very interesting that when you went to computer labs in those days, there was a very high chance that you might find this picture. And you definitely would find a picture by Maurice Cornelius Escher somewhere. You just had to look for a while. You might have to dig to the last back room, behind the cubicle. There would be an Escher, and there would probably be one of these. And this, again, is a pre-visualization of the metaverse. So the pixels were there, but it was more than just the pixels. The pixels were matched up to software. And so this was something I wasn't prepared for, because I had just been, modulating frequencies essentially for the last year. And this was the first interface I ever saw. And it blew my mind. It was called Super Paint. It was created by Shoup and his colleague, Alvy Ray Smith. As you can see, this is the first paint program that ever existed, the first way to manipulate color pixels to make pictures. And this was astonishing. So I have a little film that I think is not going to play. We had a little trouble with this. I'm going to tap the screen. If it doesn't play, I will apologize and fill in. I don't see it playing, so we're not going to see this film from the looks of things, but that's okay. Because by the end of the night, I was able to produce this. And this was my first digital image. And I'll talk a little bit about recording in a while, but the reason this exists is that a fellow named David DeFrancisco was a photographer who was a friend of Alvy's. David and Alvy, by the way, were two of the founders of Pixar and everything that came from that. And he had an SX70 Polaroid camera hooked up to a tripod, and he snapped this picture for me about 5 a.m. the first night I went down there. And that's why I have a document of the first picture I ever made on a computer. But it didn't begin or end there in a weird way, because they were thrilled to have an artist. Even though Xerox Fark wasn't interested in having an artist, Shoup and Alvy and Dick liked the idea of an artist being there. And so we started jamming, which was a way of approaching being in a room, again, not that different than a room like this, and seeing what would happen. But Xerox, in their infinite wisdom, in a very famous story that's been written about in the history of computing, decided that there was no future in color computer graphics. And so they shut the program down, literally 2 weeks after I was there. And by all rights, Xerox should own the entire computing industry. There's a reason that NVIDIA is now a $1 trillion market cap company. The graphical user interface was basically invented there. The ability to talk to printers was invented there, small talk. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. It all came out of Xerox Research Park, and none of the people who ran it had the vision to understand what they had funded. And so in 1979, a guy named Steve Jobs came in, and he saw pixels 4 years after this, and that's where Apple came from. So this was a watershed moment for me. I realized that, yes, the scales have fallen from my eyes. Digital is where the world is going to be. This is where we're going to go. So in one of the many other stories that we just don't have time to get into, I started trying to discover what else was going on. I figured there had to be something else going on. And through another incredible series of events I wish I had the time to tell, but do not, I saw this picture, which is a hand, obviously, a 3D hand made by Ed Capel, another one of the founders of Pixar. And I remember seeing this and not understanding what I was looking at. I just couldn't figure it out. I said, it's a hand, but it's obviously not a real hand. And somehow a computer was involved. I was able to get that far with it, but I couldn't figure out anything beyond that, except for that if you could make a hand, certainly there were other things you could do. So this was another aha moment. So I don't remember which first this is. Maybe this is the second first. I'm losing track of my firsts. But there was that. And then there was other information that was starting to appear. So this was a hugely influential, at least for me, a book written by Ted Nelson called, it was kind of like on a whole earth catalog format, if you remember that, oversized. And on one side, it was called Computer Lib, and on the other side, it was called Dream Machines. And he basically broke the whole thing apart. And he said, the way we're approaching computers is just idiotic. These are the coolest things that ever happened in human consciousness, and let's get on board. And he had enough chops that he could talk about different programming languages, why some were good, why some sucked. Here's what we might be able to do with this. Here's where things probably are going to be 4 or 5 years down the line. Get ready for it. So this was just a huge consciousness expander as far as figuring out what there was to do with these tools. So again, I can't get into the whole background. That's another movie. But in 1976, I moved to LA, and I wound up at a place called Triple I in Culver City, right near here. So how are we doing on time? We have 10 minutes. I haven't even gotten started. Okay, all right, roll them. Okay, I'll do Triple I. Okay, so each story gets 45 seconds. All right, okay, I'll do what I can. I'll hit the highlights. So Triple I was an amazing company. It's the first digital Hollywood film studio that ever was. It was started by John Whitney Jr., son of John Whitney Sr., who I mentioned before, and a guy named Gary Demos, I'll talk about in a minute. So it was a vast, sprawling place that was actually dedicated to something completely different that John and Gary had talked the owner of into saying, everyone goes home at 5 o'clock. We could have a digital film studio here with these very tools, because they were doing optical character recognition. So they just had all the right stuff to do it. So this was like a DEC 10 computer. There were rooms and rooms of these. And this, I remember, was the first time I was ever in a room with a megabyte of RAM. And it was a transcendental experience. I couldn't believe that I was standing in a room with a megabyte of RAM. And that was it. So without getting into it, so my world suddenly turned into this. Suddenly it was, this is where I cut my teeth. This is where I spent my first infinite hours on the keyboard. And suddenly I was punching in numbers, creating data files, and so forth. And I wish I had more time to talk about this, but I understand I only have 10 minutes anyway. So there's a lot of human stories behind all of this. This is Gary on the left. And so what would happen was I would cruise in around 5 or 6 in the evening, and I would show Gary, I'd say, look, I did this last night, and this worked, but you know what? This didn't. And he said, oh, well, let's talk about it. And so we would go out for breakfast around 3 o'clock every morning at Tiny Nailers, if anyone remembers it, on the PCH, okay? So if you were there at 3 in the morning, Gary and I were there too. And he would explain to me how the stuff really works. So, okay, so now I have to move fast. So this was my first 3D creature. It may be the first 3D creature ever made. I don't know. We're trying to look into it. Certainly the first one ever done by an artist anyway. Very simple, but it's got some kind of cool things. Notice the transparent wings. I won't get into it all now. I'm getting okay, I'm moving. I created a series of insects after a while. I'm not going to get through this in 10 minutes. It's not going to happen. Can I have 12? 20. Oh, we're good. 25. All right, okay. Let me ratchet down, back to second gear here. So after a while, I got to where the things were starting to look kind of more credible. But it's hard to explain to anyone today what was involved in doing something like this. Again, I've got 20 stories. I'll just tell one very quickly. So colors, right? So that was kind of cool. I could put colors on things. That's as far as we could go with texturing at that point, was to assign a color. And so the way you chose a color was they had something called the DFP, the digital film printer. They could do 4K resolution, so motion picture output resolution. They could generate there. And they had put onto 35 millimeter film the RGB colors for as much as they could crank out of their system, all of which lived in a series of 3-ring binders that took up an entire bookcase the size of this wall. And so you would go through the 3-ring binder and say, that green, okay, these are the RGB numbers for it. And you would type it in, and then you would assign the color, and then you would shoot the film, and then you would drop it at the MGM film drop, and then 72 hours later, it would come back and you go, oh, it's all wrong. And that was like the process. That's how we did it. And so, where today you make those decisions in literally a fraction of a second, the way God intended it. You blink your eye and you say more blue, less green, whatever. That was the rate that we were moving at with these millions of dollars worth of hardware that we were working with. Well, after a while, I had a bunch of these little critters going, and I realized I needed a world of some sort for them to inhabit so that I could figure out how to get them to jump and take off and land and fly. I got them to the way they were moving around and they were articulated and all this good stuff. And I created a 4-vertex plane for them. And without realizing it then, this was my first virtual world right there. That was the first time that I had a place where creatures could live and interact with each other. And it was a real place and you could move around it in space. But oddly enough, it hadn't really twigged in my head yet. I was still thinking in terms of animation and making movies, which was the direction of everything at that point. There were 2 things that drove the higher end of the industry at that point, one of which was the reproduction of reality. How do we make things look real? There was this thing, there was a list, it would change sometimes, but there was a list of 10 unsolved problems in computer graphics. So there was like clouds, hair, fur. How do we do it in capital letters? Like we figured out how to make an object, but how do you make that object look believable to the human eye? So there was this huge push in that direction. And the other was the fantasy that one day there was going to be a feature-length animated film. And how do you do that? Remember, this is a quarter of a century before Toy Story. So that was like totally delusional. But people were doing like 20, 30-second commercials at, $350,000 a piece, which in those days was real money. And that's how the medium developed. And there's a million stories about that, and I'm going to imagine some people in this room participated in that. But after being at III for a year, a little more than that, I wound up at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. If you've never been to JPL, it's like the size of a college campus. It's kind of what it looks like. It's up around La Cañada, if you know where that is. They redrew the Pasadena line so that technically it was in Pasadena. It's not really, but it belongs to Caltech. And so they had to have it kind of in the city limits. So they just changed the city limits. This was the building where it all happened, building 264. Got a lot of stories about this I won't get into, but it was because of this one man, Robert Holtzman, who was the godfather, who created this unbelievable lab. It too wasn't any bigger than this room. It was a magical little place devoted to research. And Bob just happened to be a great lover of art. And when he hooked up, he said, it'd be great to have an artist in residence here. And I said, yeah, that would be great. And he said, how'd you like to do that? And I said, I think I would. So that's how I wound up at JPL. But I have to show this because in the archaeology side of this little object took 1.5 years to generate. That's how hard it was just to get with a hard pass onto the JPL graphics lab in order to be able to go in every night and treat it as my studio. And so this little object has great meaning to me because that was what opened the door. But it wasn't like you went down to Best Buy and you picked up a machine and you came home and you hooked up to some servers run by Amazon up there and you started computing at a high level. Just getting near the machines. I call those years the access years. Okay, should I go to 3rd gear now? 4th gear? 4th gear? Okay, we're moving up to 4th gear again. III was end of 76 and 1977. I moved over to JPL. I had hooked up with JPL in 76, but along with the 1.5 years it took me to get a pass, it took them 1.5 years to get the machines up and running. Another story that I've got backstories to, I will not get into. This was kind of the core group besides Bob. It was a very small group. That's Jim Blinn on the left, who's a famous character in the movies. This is Sylvie Ruth, who was his assistant. This is Julian Gomez, who kept the machines running. And without the 3 of them, I never could have done what I did. It was a real team effort of a certain kind. And I did a talk about this at SIGGRAPH a few years ago. and they wanted me to talk about how we all collaborated. I said, you know what? We never collaborated. We never worked on a project together, not really. But what we did was we cooperated. And so, at 2 in the morning, I might go over to Jim and say, because all of this happened 5 to 9. Everything happened at night. Computers don't wake up till midnight. And so I'd say, we got some issues here. Whenever things get close to the clipping plane, everything falls apart. And he would say, well, let me see what I can do about that. And he said, by the way, there's this like weird fractal thing I was thinking about last night. You might be interested in that. And so that was sort of the ambiance of how we worked together. And fortunately, everybody was into art. Honestly, this is the only place on the planet, I'm sure, that what happened in that room could have happened. It's another California story for sure. But everything revolves around paying the bills. JPL had to pay the bills for the graphics lab. And so Bob worked out a deal where the upcoming Voyager flybys, we would make, not we, because I was there purely as an artist, the lab would produce these animated films that were pre-visualizations of actually going by the planet. So every day, the Voyager was sending back closer and closer and closer pictures. Those would go into mapping and texturizing this simulated flyby. The flyby was finished kind of like I just did this talk at like 5 a.m. before the actual contact. It was distributed to the world and it was seen by billions of people. It was like one of the most successful films ever made. And so JPL Brass loved us after that, and we could do what we wanted for a long time. Okay, now I've got 4 minutes left? 5 minutes? I have 5 minutes? Okay. Okay, I'm going to pack the next 45 years into 5 minutes. There's nothing to it, I'm sure. But I'm just going to show pictures. 5 minutes. Okay. So these were the commands to turn on the machine. You wanted to turn on the machine, you had to go through these steps. This is me going through those steps with our UDP-11, it was the size of a horse. This was called a mini computer at the time. This is what the actual work environment looked like. So there were 2 rooms and you were in a different place depending on what kind of work you're doing. But this is what it looked most of the time. It was lights out, 50 degrees. It was like living on a spaceship. And that affected a lot of the imagery that came out. I had hoped to talk a little bit more about this because I wanted to talk more about virtual worlds and the metaverse side of things. But we had something called the Picture System 2, made by a company called Evans and Sutherland. They created line drawing systems. And even though it wasn't as sophisticated visually as all of the textured stuff that I'll show you in a minute, what it did do was let me move around in real time. And so this changed everything. And so I went from my original point of view, which was making pictures with reference to a picture plane, to going through the picture plane and now being in this other place like we're in this room right now. And I wish I had a lot more time to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about this. Never mind. Textures. What's on the left, that's what things looked like until the work that was done at the lab, and that's where textures came in. And this is using a bump mapping technique that was developed by Jim Blinn and by my good friend, Lance Williams. And I just learned about some of this connection not very long ago from Jim when we were talking about this picture. This is the first picture I ever made that hit, that had like a real life of its own. I still get requests for this thing today. It's still being printed in books and stuff. But those textures that you see, Lance had created a kind of a rivet texture as an experiment to be used for the cover of a SIGGRAPH proceedings coming up. And I got a hold of the code and I said, gee, what else could we do with this? And just like at Xerox PARC, there was a lot of just sharing of ideas flowing around. And so without Jim and Lance, I never would have come up with the idea to make this picture, even though neither of them ever touched it. Oh gosh, I can't talk about all this stuff. Some of you will recognize some of these pictures, right? Yeah.
Spend the next 3 hours here.
I have so much to say in so little time. Yeah, they'll have to take 2 or something. This was, I don't know if this will even play. There's a little animation here somewhere. Is there an animation? Yes,
Yeah, it was.
It was playing? Yeah. It shows what I know. Let me give it another shot. Yes. Gee. Valuable seconds are ticking by. Yeah? Wait, I'm waiting. Waiting for something to happen. Food animation. You have to imagine in your head, it's really great. Took me like months, like a year or two to do this, but think of it in your head and oh, but you know, this is exactly what it was like in real time. It was like, can I get this for work? 16 hours later, I think it's working. No, maybe it's, wait, yes it is. Oh, it's tomorrow already. So yeah, that's a story of my life at that time. Okay, I'm just gonna tell one more story then. I'm gonna clip through this stuff. And it's about the transition into the metaverse. And so one of the things that Julian got up and running was a computer game called Adventure. It was like the first major text adventure. It had other, it was also known as Colossal Cave later. It became Zork, which some of you may be familiar with. But it started like this. You are standing at the end of the road, beside a building, around you is a forest. And then you could go into this, and by text commands, you move to this whole world that had been created. And that got me thinking that making pictures is a lot more about designing as you would, a picture like Leonardo would on a panel. It's also different from animation, which is what I had hoped to show you a minute ago, which I devoted many, many hundreds of thousands of hours to. It was about something else. And so kicking off that idea, I created this underground world. This was my first really complex underground world. The other stuff existed in 3 space. Those were worlds for sure, but I hadn't thought it through in terms of the complete mapping of an environment that you could move around in. And so these are stills from that first underground world. You could go into these buildings. There were things that happened in them. I was desperately trying to get life forms to happen in them, which turned out to be a lot more complicated than one might think. And then I created, over time, worlds that existed underwater. I started getting involved with creating atmospheres, atmospherics. It's like 1985, 86 at this point. And so really taking it into a different kind of place. And then the whole generative idea became real to me. And I realized that these things were really data structures that could be brought to life and evolve. And so I started creating evolving worlds. I was working mostly in the still form out of the basic reality that each frame took over an hour to generate. So the idea of 30 frames per second or 24 frames per second, 1 second per day, is one of the reasons I got out of animation. But I was able to explore these worlds in pretty comparatively high resolution and evolve them into places where now the machine and I were interacting with each other in a more conscious kind of form. And so this is the last picture I made at JPL, where I had the world evolving and I had the objects inside it evolving, which was really more than the system had ever been designed to handle. And so that was the end of that. And I have a full thing talk about documenting how this stuff came to the attention of the world. This is the press release for the first time pictures were ever shown electronically. Working with SIGGRAPH in Dallas in 1981, we created a computer room, again, the size of this room, and we showed pictures on screens coming right out of the machine, I believe for the first time ever on the planet. And so that was really exciting. And then it was the media that brought it to the public attention. And there were just so many, it was just, the world was hungry for it. The art world was not hungry for it. I just, maybe I should even wind up here. I don't know. I've got decades to go through yet. But this is a letter about someone tried to sell Art Forum, which was the leading magazine at that time, on doing some features involving Chuck Surrey, who was one of the great pioneers of the medium. And as they say, I cannot imagine Art Forum ever doing an issue on electronics or computers in art, but you never know. Okay, so there's vision for you. That's how the art world was relating to it. And I got 100 stories about that too. I won't go into it. I'll just say, from there, PCs happened, but PCs weren't really there yet, but the parts and pieces were. So I started building machines. This was my first personal computer, built in 1975, working with 3 engineers. Then I spent some time at Apple Computer. And there, I worked with a couple groups there. One was the Advanced Technology Group, where we worked on a film. But I also spent the better part of a season working with another group they had there that was involved in trying to get ideas of what you could do with computers into people's hands. And they had a little room with everything that an Apple computer could connect to. And they had a machine called the Mac 2FX. And I really believe that is when personal computing, in terms of this level of images, happened. And this was the first time I ever worked with commercial software. The fact that there was such a thing as a manual blew my mind. And there are a lot of people in computer art who think that if you work with commercial software, you're not really making art. I'm not one of them. I love commercial software when it works. And where we are now is so far beyond what any of us is going to like program. I mean, really, compared to where we're going with AI, generative art. I mean, we're just living on another planet now. But this is some of the stuff I did at Apple in that little room, and I was able to start building creatures finally that could move around the world. This is 1991, I believe. 91. Pretty sure that was 1991. Yeah, so these were all, I did these in 1991. Eventually, I kept on building computers. Another long story I won't get into. I'm going to wind up now, I promise. And I got a studio in the old City Hall in Sierra Madre, which is in the foothills above Pasadena. I had the bottom floor of the building, and there continued building. Now I had the cooperation of a lot of computer manufacturers for reasons, there's a backstory to that. But now I was able to start introducing things like dynamics, wind, gravity, all of that stuff, and starting to take this into a place where I felt much more in partnership with the computer rather than in control of the computer. So I could throw things at it and said, let's take a bunch of polygons, throw them in the air, let them fall, but when they get to about here, let's just like have a hurricane blast through and see what happens. And this took it to a whole different kind of place in terms of the process of image making. So these were images made during this period and a little after. I moved to West LA and started working with some other software. Some of this is made by this amazing Russian coder that I got to work with for a little while. But as I'm told that I ran out of time several minutes ago, this is kind of where I'm at now. I do an awful lot of it on a pane of glass. There's a piece of glass, and that's my interface to almost everything. I'm not sure that's how it's going to stay, but now these are some of my early experiments with AI, and I was saying this to someone else in the room before we got going. I am not threatened by AI when it comes to art making. This is what I always wanted. This is exactly what I always wanted. It, too, has turned out to be just a fabulous partner to take ideas into places I might not have thought of otherwise. I can tell it how far to go. I can pull it back if I need to. I realize it spells the doom of all human civilization. But aside from that, downside, on the creative side, it's just an amazing tool that is taking us places no one's ever been. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. All right. If anyone's got questions, I'll be happy to answer any questions that anybody has. I see a hand.
I just want to know when part 2 is.
What?
When part 2 is.
Oh, part 2. Well, stay tuned. And we'll see what we can do about that. There's a part 2 and there's a part 3 as well. We'll see if we can get there. Okay, Dina. Well, how am I doing my AI? Very much a work in process. I worked with a number of different systems, and because of this archiving thing, it's all gone under the back burner. And hopefully, in about 3 weeks, it's going to come right back onto the front burner. But yes, that's my next goal: is to train it on all of my life's work, going back to childhood. And there's a whole bunch of stuff when I was designing things, especially when I was at JPL, that I was just never able to pull off because it just wasn't there yet. But the ideas are on paper, and I want to scan those and feed that into several different AIs and see where that takes me. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes. Oh, Bina, tell us what the QR code is for. So get it while you can. Yeah, there's what, 50 of them? Is that right?
Right. No, talk to Beard Dean.
You would buy my first one. Okay, anybody else? Yes, I see a hand.
David, I don't know if you're gonna recognize my description of the bigger pictures, but it was an early one and it was blue with these verticals going back in space and textures around them areas. And you described that as somebody coming up with the ability to make those textures, and then you created this thing. But it was after your interface with fractile concepts. And so, and in some of your things, I kept seeing things that got bigger and then smaller and then smaller. So was that a marriage, do you think, of these new technologies and fractality?
Well, okay, so that picture, I know what picture you're talking about. It's called Aku. It really, to me, was like the first real picture I made at JPL. Everything before that had been an experiment. I stayed up all night making it, and I remember at like 5 in the morning looking at it and going, whoa, how did that happen? And not really, I knew obviously I had made it because there was nobody else in the room, but I didn't remember any of the steps that I had taken to get there, oddly enough. But it is very much true that the medium suggests things. You know, there are all kinds of experiments in symmetry. I got interested in all kinds of world cultures as a result, you know, Persian design. I mean, so many things came because I would see things and I'd go, well, somebody else must have dealt with this before. And then I would find rich tapestries that had never come to me through my normal art world education background. And so Aku is probably an example of that, of things that some of it came from me, but some of it was also suggested by the medium. And there were a lot of accidental things that happened as well, especially during that period, that I just loved when I hated it when things fell apart and there was nothing to show for it. But one time out of 50, things would fall apart and I'd go, yeah, all right, I never could have done that. So, you know, as a post-John Cage child, I found that a very attractive place to be as a medium. Yeah. Okay, last chance. We're done? Okay, thanks everybody. It's been a lot of fun.